Hey everybody, Jim here with another video for you. This is a special one-off. This is a kind of a tribute to my dad since it's Father's Day weekend. But before we begin, at the end of this video, if you like this content, please give me a thumbs up, a possible subscribe, but most importantly, leave comments below. Let me know what some of your favorite memories are of seeing films with your father or films that your father inspired you to watch. That's kind of what this video is. My dad passed away in 2001, and him and my mother are very big, or were in his case, movie fans, and they instilled that into me, obviously. So I figured, since it's Father's Day, I was thinking about some of the movies that he either introduced me to or that we saw together, and I figured I would just kind of throw this together as a little tribute, and hopefully I don't get too emotional. But first couple, we're going to start off with not so much this movie, but my dad was a huge Burt Reynolds fan. And one of his favorite Burt Reynolds films was Deliverance, co-starring Jon Voight, Ronny Cox, and poor Ned Beatty. When I was a kid when this movie came out, the only thing I knew about it, because of course I was too young to see this when it was released theatrically in the early 70s, but Dueling Banjos was a huge hit. It was actually a single that they played on the radio, and I knew that. And I also knew about Squeal Like a Pig, and Boy, You Sure Got a Pretty Mouth, but I didn't know the context of it until I saw this movie much later. And then I was horrified. But this is a classic film, and like I said, my dad was a huge Burt Reynolds fan. Basically anything that Burt was in, my dad went and saw. But probably his favorite Burt Reynolds film, and it's one of mine as well, is The Longest Yard. This is from 1974, and it co-stars Eddie Albert and a bunch of real-life football players at the time. And I think that was one of the reasons why my dad loved this movie so much, because my dad was a huge football fan. Green Bay Packers, he was a huge Packer fan. And Ray Nitschke, who was a lineman for the Packers, played one of the guards in this movie. But yeah, I've seen this movie a million times, and I love it as well. It's one of my favorite Burt Reynolds movies of all time, for sure. Another one of his favorite actors was Steve McQueen. And Bullitt was definitely one of his favorites. He would go on for years and years about how Bullitt had the best car chase of all time, although he was also a very big fan of the car chase in The French Connection. In the 80s, I would argue with him about what car chase was better, this one or To Live and Die in LA, because that car chase to me is still the greatest non-CG car chase ever. But again, Bullitt's a great movie, and Steve McQueen, it doesn't get much cooler than him. Another actor that he also introduced me to, because he was a huge fan, was Charles Bronson. And in this 4-movie collection, Hard Times, I actually did see with my father and my family at the drive-in back in the 70s. And that movie also co-stars James Coburn and Jill Ireland, who was married to Charles Bronson. But my dad was a huge Bronson fan. Anything that Bronson was in, he was there. But after I had already gotten a taste of those two actors, he introduced me to this film, The Great Escape, which of course has both of them in it, among many, many others. He introduced this to me when it was on TV one day, when cable first became a thing. This was probably around 1980 or so. So I was probably about 12 or 13 first time I saw this movie, and I immediately loved it. I just thought it was one of the coolest movies ever. And again, Steve McQueen is unbelievably cool in this movie. That's why he always gets sent to the cooler. Sorry for the bad pun. Another one that he introduced me around that time, this one was The Bridge on the River Kwai. And the reason why he got me to watch this one is because he knew how much of a Star Wars nerd I was and told me, hey, that guy from Star Wars that you love so much, and he never could say Obi-Wan. He would just say that guy in the robe with the sword, the old guy, because my dad was not really a Star Wars guy. But when he informed me that he made a World War II movie that was one of the greatest World War II movies ever, I was immediately intrigued. And again, we watched it together on TV, and it blew my mind. And again, this is one of my favorite war movies ever. And also around that same time, he introduced me to this film, The Dirty Dozen, which again had Bronson in it. But this was probably the first movie I ever saw Lee Marvin in. And my dad was a huge Lee Marvin fan. And again, The Dirty Dozen is one of my favorite. I'm going to definitely sound like a broken record here because there is a motif here. Because of my father, again, one of my favorite war films ever. He was also a John Wayne fan, and so am I. But even my dad would admit that The Green Berets is not a good movie. He more or less liked John Wayne's Westerns. And speaking of Westerns, we're going back in time a little bit. 1976. I'm 9 years old. And my dad was a huge Clint Eastwood fan. And we went and saw this. The Outlaw Josie Wales. Which was probably the first Western I ever saw. Definitely the first Western I ever saw theatrically. And it was probably the first time I ever saw Clint Eastwood in a movie. I may have seen something, along the lines of one of the earlier Dirty Harry movies. But again, I was really too young. I knew who Clint Eastwood was. But until this movie, this was definitely, as far as I can remember, the first one. And I thought Clint, instead of Steve McQueen, was now the coolest guy ever. And I told my dad that was the best Western ever, even though, again, it was probably the first Western I ever saw. And he said, oh, yeah? Let me tell you about a movie called The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now, I knew of this movie before I saw it because he actually had the soundtrack album on vinyl. And I thought the music on it was the coolest ever. And I still do. Let's face it. Ennio Morricone's score all of his scores are great, but The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, without a doubt, is his masterpiece, in my opinion. But The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is definitely my favorite Western of all time. Right next to this one, The Magnificent Seven, that he also introduced me to. And again, Steve McQueen and Charles Bronson again, but then there's James Coburn, who was also in Hard Times. And, oh yeah, I love it. He also introduced me to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now, I knew who Paul Newman and Robert Redford were by the time I saw this movie. But again, never saw the movie. I knew Raindrops Are Falling on My Head. That was it. Absolutely love all three of these movies. These two are definitely in my top 10 Westerns of all time. And he also introduced me to this. Because of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, he introduced me to Once Upon a Time in the West. Another Sergio Leone classic. I saw this one before I saw the rest of the Dollars trilogy, believe it or not. And again, seeing Henry Fonda as a villain completely blew my mind. And still does. He's incredible in this movie. Everybody's incredible in this movie. And by the way, our buddy Charles Bronson's back. Excellent flick. Now, the rest of these, me and my dad saw theatrically together. We're going to start off with Capricorn 1. One of my favorite conspiracy thrillers ever. I love this film so much. This came out in 1978. I was 11 years old. And again, it just blew my mind. And I still absolutely love this film. He also took me to see this in 1978. The Wild Geese. And the main reason why he took me to see this was because I was obsessed with Roger Moore because of James Bond. I was going to break out my James Bond box set because he also introduced me to James Bond, of course. And until the day he died, me and him would argue over who the best Bond was. I was a Roger Moore kid because I grew up with him. My dad, as far as he was concerned, the only James Bond was Sean Connery. But again, I absolutely love this film because of my dad. And then going back to Lee Marvin, we saw this one at the drive-in together in 1980. And again, I was most excited to see this because it had Mark Hamill in it from Star Wars. And he was most excited to see it because it had Lee Marvin in it. And we both absolutely loved this film. Unfortunately, my dad never got a chance to see the reconstructed version. He passed away before it was released. But he did love the theatrical version, and so do I. This is one of my favorite, again, not to sound like a broken record, this one's probably in my top 10 World War II movies ever. I love this film. Then he took me to see this cheese fest, The Soldier. And this movie is really, really ridiculous. 1982, so I would have been about 15 here. And again, this movie's a lot of fun, and it's not good. I mean, it's a B movie at best. But again, my dad loved these types of action movies, and this movie came and went in a heartbeat. But I can definitely say I saw this theatrically because of my father. Then we got another drive-in flick, The Road Warrior. Now, I know everywhere else in the world it's known as Mad Max 2, but here it was The Road Warrior. And they did not market this as a sequel of any kind, okay? I mean, this was marketed as like an original type film. And again, we saw this at the drive-in. I do not remember what played with it, but I remember my father originally when they first started talking with the accents, during the narration. My dad was one of those types of guys. Sometimes was like, oh, I don't know if I want to watch this. And as soon as he saw the first action scene, he was in. And by the end of the movie, he was blown away, as was I. One of my favorite films again. I mentioned earlier with the James Bond thing that my dad was a huge Sean Connery fan. So, of course, we went and saw Outland together. My dad was not a science fiction guy per se. I mean, there were certain science fiction movies that he enjoyed, but for the most part, he didn't like science fiction that much. But he made the exception in this case because, again, Sean Connery, he loved him, but this was marketed as a Western, and a Western set in space, and it is. This is literally High Noon in space. It's the same exact story as High Noon. Again, love this film. Love it, love it, love it. He also took me to see Southern Comfort, which, outside of The Warriors, is my favorite Walter Hill film. And this is the movie that definitely made me a fan of Powers Booth. And I love Powers Booth, R.I.P. He's incredible in this movie. The man was incredible in every movie. Absolutely love this film. Then we're jumping forward in time a little more. 1983. I was working at the theater at that point. So I basically saw everything I wanted on my own, but I would give my parents passes to come see whatever they wanted for free. And occasionally, a movie would come out that my mom would have no desire to see, so I would go with my dad on my night off. And one such movie was Scarface. And my dad absolutely loved this film. Now, I had just turned 16 when this movie came out. And quite honestly, I didn't understand most of it as far as like the cocaine and everything else. I mean, to me, it was just this crazy action movie. But my dad absolutely loved it. And years later, yes, anybody who's seen my top 25 of the 80s knows this movie's one of those. I love Scarface to death. We got two left. We're going to start off with this one, The Patriot. This came out in 2000. And this was the last movie I got to watch with my dad theatrically. He passed away about 9 months later. give or take, of cancer. But he loved it because he was a big Mel Gibson fan, and that really kind of started with The Road Warrior. And then the Lethal Weapon movies totally took that into a different level. And yeah, he loved Mel Gibson. And so do I. And I love this movie. It's definitely Roland Emmerich's best movie. And again, I cannot watch this movie without thinking about my dad. But I saved this one for last. John Carpenter's The Thing. He took me to see this in 1982 when it came out. Because again, my mom had no desire to see this whatsoever. And he was a fan of the original from the 50s. So he took me and my buddy Rob to see this. And the scene where McCready's doing the blood test with the hot needle and the blood jumps out of the petri dish. I literally jumped into the man's lap and threw my popcorn all over him, just as a reflex motion. I was so embarrassed. And he just laughed. And I composed myself and we watched the rest of the movie. And when the movie was over, I was like, so, what'd you think? And he went, it was okay. And I said, what do you mean it was okay? That movie was phenomenal. He's like, it was okay. And that's all he said. I heard him talking to my mom later that night. He was like, you know what, Mary? That movie was phenomenal. I just didn't want to give him the satisfaction because I was still picking popcorn out of my hair. That was my father. R.I.P. I love you, Dad. Happy Father's Day to all of you. See you on the next one.